In this lecture presentation, we're going to talk about speciation. As you listen to the lecture, please take note on pages 13 and 14 of your Unit 7 packet. Let's talk about some terms first. The term evolution refers to any changes that happen in a population across multiple generations. And the term population genetics refers to the field of study that tracks these changes in a population. We're particularly looking at the changes in the frequency of alleles and genotypes. So here's a really important slide. And these are the 5 primary forces that causes a population to evolve. They're natural selection, mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and mate choice. And you need to be able to memorize all 5 of them and be able to explain each one really clearly. That is really, really important. Okay, so now let's talk about the first primary force, which is natural selection. Natural selection occurs when individuals in a population do not have the same chances of surviving or reproducing due to their genetic traits. There are 3 different types of natural selection: stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. So let's talk about each one. Stabilizing selection is when individuals with the medium phenotype is favored by natural selection, which means individuals born with a medium phenotype, they better survive. As a result, they tend to leave more offspring, so they're more likely to pass on their traits. Directional selection is when natural selection favors only one extreme over the others. Disruptive selection is when natural selection favors both sides of the extremes. So let's take a look at some real-life scenarios. And as I read each scenario, I want you to think about what type of natural selection this may be and why. Again, your choices are stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. So scenario number 1, human babies born at an average mass are more likely to survive than babies born either much smaller or much larger than average. So this is an example of stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection. That is because babies that are born too small, they may be premature and they may have medical complications or developmental issues. Babies that are born too large, they may also have some medical conditions or they may simply experience more complications during the actual birthing process. As a result, babies with a medium average birth weight, they're more likely to survive and grow up to leave more offspring. So this is an example of stabilizing selection. So here's the second scenario. Galapagos marine iguanas weigh between 1 to 12 kilograms. That is a wide range. Now, females select larger males during the mating season. However, these larger males have lower chances of surviving during the El Nino-related famines when their algae, their primary food source, largely disappears. Because larger males, they require more food to keep up their energy demands. So I want you to pause and think about what type of natural selection this may be and come back to the video. So this is an example of disruptive selection. That is because the females are selecting the larger males. So the larger males are favored and they're more likely to leave more offspring because they are more successful during the mating season. Now, during the El Nino season, when food becomes scarce, the smaller males, they have higher chances of surviving and therefore they're going to survive and reproduce. Right? Because their smaller bodies don't require as much food to sustain themselves. As a result, they have higher chances of surviving and therefore they're more likely to reproduce and leave more offspring. So that means the medium-sized iguanas, they don't have any benefit. As a result, they're actually selected against. Okay, scenario number 3. Peccaries are predators of cacti living in the desert. They love to eat fleshy stems even though they are covered in spines. Despite having tough mouths, the peccaries choose to eat cacti with the fewest number of spines. So I want you to think about what type of selection this may be. So this is an example of directional selection because as a result, the cactus will evolve to have more and more and more spines to deter the peccaries, their predators, from eating them so that they can increase their chances to survive and reproduce. So this is an example of directional selection in which only one extreme, only the cacti with more great number of spines will survive. Okay, so that sums up the first force of evolution, which is natural selection. Now let's go to the second one, which is mutations. Mutations can produce new alleles, new genes, or new combinations of genes. And all of these can lead to a potentially beneficial trait, beneficial phenotype that may be selected for by natural selection, and that will cause the population to evolve. So now in this class, we already talked about two different types of mutation, point mutation and frame shift mutation. Point mutation is when only a single base is replaced, only a single base is changed, and that can potentially significantly impact the shape and function of the protein. Whereas deletion or insertion or any type of frame shift mutation will actually cause a drastic change in the produced protein, and that can cause the function of the protein to be eliminated, or it can be changed in potentially positive ways. In addition to these two different types of mutations that occurs in the base level, mutations can also happen on the chromosome level. Chromosomal mutations. So this diagram shows 4 different types of chromosomal mutations. Deletion is when a section of the chromosome entirely gets deleted. Duplication is when a section of chromosome gets copied. Inversion is when the order and sequence of the genes becomes jumbled up. And translocation, this is an interesting one. Translocation is when 2 non-homologous chromosomes, they kind of wrap up with each other. They physically break off and exchange bits and pieces of their chromosomes. Kind of similar to crossing over, but again, translocation is happening between 2 non-homologous chromosomes. So as a result, it can potentially produce new combinations of genes that can lead to the evolution of new beneficial proteins and new beneficial phenotypes. So that's mutation. Now, gene flow. This is another easy one. Gene flow occurs when new genes or new alleles are introduced into a population when different individuals, genetically different individuals, they migrate into a population and they start breeding. And that's kind of a common sense. When new individuals come into a population, they bring their genes with them. Genetic drift, that's the fourth force. And now genetic drift refers to any changes that happen in the frequency of an existing gene in a population due to random chances. The key word here is random chances. There are 2 different types of genetic drift. They're founder effect and bottleneck effect. Let's talk about each one. Okay. So the first one, let's look at the diagram on the left. So here we have the original beetles population, beetles or ladybugs. And as you can see, the proportion of the green beetles and the red beetles, they're kind of similar. They're kind of half and half in the original population. Then, just by chance, a subset of the original population, they started migrating to an isolated island. Okay, and again, just by chance, all 4 of the migrating individuals happen to be red beetles. Then these red beetles, they started reproducing among themselves. As a result, the resulting population on the isolated island looks very different from the original population, which means evolution has occurred. And this is a type of genetic drift called founder effect. The key word for founder effect is migration. Migration to an isolated area. Okay, so let's take a look at the diagram on the right side. So let's take a look at the original population. And again, we're looking at some beetles. And the ratio of the blue beetles and red beetles is about 1-to-1, like 5 beetles each. So it's pretty equal. Then some random event happened. Okay, so in this case, it's a human like slapping and killing off these beetles randomly. But in nature, this random event may be an earthquake, it may be a fire, it may be radiation exposure, any one of these. So some kind of natural disaster happened and it randomly killed off a lot of the blue beetles. As a result, the remaining population was predominantly red beetles, and the remaining population continued to breed and reproduce. As a result, after many generations, the resulting beetle population became predominantly red. And the population has evolved due to this random event. So we call this type of genetic drift bottleneck effect. And the key word for bottleneck effect is death of a large number of individuals in a population due to a random event. Okay, so here's a pretty fun video, okay, that compares and contrasts bottlenecking and founder effect. So you can use the tiny URL link to watch this video, and it will help you distinguish between the two two different types of genetic drift. Okay, so here's a real life scenario. I want you to decide whether this example is an example of founder effect or bottleneck effect. So the present Amish population in the US grew from 200 founders who came to the US from Germany and Switzerland in the mid-1700s. Since then, they followed a simple lifestyle and rarely intermarried with people outside of their own community. One of the original founders carried an allele for having 6 fingers, okay? Having extra fingers and short limb, which we call polydactyl trait. Today, the Amish population has far more cases of this syndrome, polydactyl syndrome, than any other population in the world. So the key word that we need to look for here is migration of a small group of individuals. Okay, so, and just by chance, out of the 200 founders, one of them carried the allele for polydactylism. As a result, the resulting population has very high prevalence of having 6 fingers. So this is an example of founder effect. Okay, founder effect. Oop. And nowhere in this scenario we're seeing like the death of the majority of the population. So this is founder effect, where a small subset of individuals are migrating to an isolated area. Okay, so let's go to the last force of evolution, that is mate choice or sexual selection. This occurs mostly when females choose males based on certain heritable traits represented by their phenotype. So let's take a look at these peacocks here. So this is a male, which we commonly call as peacock, and this is a female, which we call peahen. Now, when peahens, they choose their mate, they selectively go for peacocks with very elaborate, colorful tails. Even though these elaborate, colorful tails give these males a disadvantage because predators can easily spot them. Now, Darwin was really troubled and puzzled by this phenomenon because he strongly believed in natural selection. So individuals who survive better will reproduce better, and as a result, those traits will be passed on with higher frequency. But when Darwin saw this peacock example, he became deeply troubled. And he pondered about this problem a lot, and this is evident in his journals. Now modern scientists believe that the reason why peahens prefer peacocks with really colorful tails is because this bright coloration in birds may hint that their reproductive ability, their sperm qualities are better and healthier. Okay, so that is what modern scientists believe. Okay, so in summary, these 5 evolutionary forces, they're occurring simultaneously and they're interacting with one another. So in other words, the overall outcome of their interaction determines the direction and rate of evolution, meaning it determines how and how fast the evolution will occur. Okay, so modern concept of species. Number 1, species contain groups of interbreeding populations connected by gene flow, meaning they have to live in the same geographic location, and they have to be able to mate with one another. The species is a natural fundamental unit of evolution, and each species is a product of a unique and independent evolutionary pathway. Okay, so that's the modern concept of species. There are 3 different types of species that is based on this concept. They are biological definition, phylogenetic definition, and morphological definition. So let's talk about each one. Biological concept of definition, this is the most common one that we use. So we say when two individuals cannot interbreed or fail to produce fertile offspring, we categorize them as 2 separate species. That's biological species concept. Now, phylogenetic species concept is dependent on the evolutionary history. So according to this definition, each species, they have their own unique evolutionary history, and they have to occupy a unique place on the phylogenetic tree. The last one is morphological species definition. According to this definition, individuals that belong to the same species, they should share the same overall morphological features, like physical appearance. So here's a question for you. So here we have a picture of many different breeds of dogs. So my question to you is, do different dog breeds belong to the same species? I want you to ponder about this question based on these 3 different species concept, species definition. And the answer is yes, they belong to the same species, even though they look very different from one another. They have different shapes and sizes and furs. They are still able to interbreed with one another to produce viable and fertile offspring, and they all occupy the same place on the phylogenetic tree. Now, here's another question. Do horses and donkeys belong to the same species? So we have donkeys over here, horses over here. So I want you to ponder about this question. And the answer is no, they do not belong to the same species because now donkeys and horses, they can interbreed with one another to produce a viable offspring, which we call mules. Okay, but mules are healthy and they're very useful for farming or what other purposes that humans use them for, but they are infertile. They are sterile. They are not able to reproduce. Since donkeys and horses cannot produce fertile offspring, we categorize donkeys and horses as 2 separate species. Okay, so now let's talk about the stages or steps required for speciation to happen. So speciation requires a sufficient amount of genetic differences and reproductive isolation between populations. It occurs in 3 main stages. Stage number 1, a breeding population becomes isolated in time or space. Then the derived population becomes reproductively isolated. They no longer breed with one another. Then finally, the breeding population diverges genetically, meaning they accumulate enough genetic differences, which renders them unable to breed with one another, even when the 2 individuals are brought together in the same time and the same space. So let's talk about the reproductive barriers that will cause speciation. There are 2 main types of reproductive barriers: prezygotic barriers, which prevents the formation of zygote. Zygote, remember, is the fusion of a sperm and an egg, right? So prezygotic barriers means that it either prevents mating from taking place or mating may take place, but the zygotes are not compatible and they're not going to produce a viable zygote that can develop into an individual. So there are 5 subtypes of prezygotic barriers. Temporal isolation, as the name suggests, refers to different mating time. So the most common example occurs in plants, where different species of plants produce flowers at different seasons, like different months. So as a result, they are not able to interbreed. Behavioral isolation is when individuals have different mating signals, which can include things like mating rituals, mating dance, mating calls, and individuals with different mating signal, they're not attracted to one another. So that's behavioral isolation. So the most common type of behavioral isolation occurs in birds. Then mechanical isolation is when the reproductive organs are not compatible. Habitat isolation is when individuals are living in the same geographic area, but they're utilizing very different resources, or they have very different way of living, which we call niche. As a result, they become reproductively isolated and they can eventually become different species. Gametic isolation is when the gametes are unable to fuse together to form a viable zygote that can further develop. So now let's talk about the second main type. It's called post-zygotic barriers. Post-zygotic barriers means that you can make a zygote, but that zygote fails to develop into a fertile adult. So there are three main subtypes. Reduced hybrid viability is when a zygote is formed, but that zygote fails to develop further, which means that individual cannot be born. Reduced hybrid fertility means that the hybrid individual is viable, healthy, but is infertile. So the example that we talked about so far is the mule. When donkeys and horses breed with one another, they produce a mule which is healthy, which is viable, but that mule is sterile. Hybrid breakdown is when the offspring of the hybrids, not the hybrids themselves, but the offspring of the hybrids are weak or sterile. So these are the three different types of post-zygotic barriers. Okay, so here's a really fun video on the different types of mating rituals found in birds. So this video is about 4 minutes, and this is really fun and interesting, and it presents a really interesting example of behavioral isolation in birds. Okay, so use that tiny URL link to watch the video and come back to the video. Come back to the lecture video to take notes. All right, so now let's talk about types of speciation. Okay, so there are three main types, and allopatric speciation is the most common type of speciation. And this occurs, let's use the diagram to explain this one. So here is the original population. Then some kind of geographic barrier separates the original population. So that geographic barrier can be like bodies of water, like rivers. It can be fire. It can be valleys, canyon. It can be anything that is preventing the individuals from migrating in between the regions. Then, so that means that each population is interbreeding among themselves independently for multiple generations. And that is, as a result, after multiple generations, each population accumulates like enough genetic differences, and they eventually evolve into two separate species. So even when we bring these individuals together in the same space and same time, they are no longer able to interbreed with one another. So that's allopatric speciation. And the key word for allopatric speciation is geographic barrier. Okay, sympatric speciation. So let's again use the diagram to explain this one. So here's the original population. And all these individuals are living in the same geographic area. So it's not like there is some kind of geographic barrier that's separating them. They're still living in the same area, but they are utilizing very different resources, or they have different timing in reproduction for whatever reasons. Individuals living in the same area, they start reproducing among themselves depending on what kind of niche they occupy within that space. As a result, they evolve into two separate species because they accumulate enough genetic differences due to that reproductive barrier. The last one is parapatric speciation. This is really rare in nature, so you don't have to worry about this one so much. But this happens in hybrid zones where two very different type of soils or two very different type of climate can coexist in the same geographic area. So now I'm going to give you some real life scenarios. I want you to try to identify each example as sympatric, allopatric, or parapatric speciation. So here's scenario number 1. So take a look at the picture. So these are 4 different groups of Grand Canyon squirrels. So obviously Grand Canyon, for those of you who've been to Grand Canyon, these are really large immense structures. Okay, so that Grand Canyon, the formation of Grand Canyon, separated the original squirrel population into 4 distinct regions. And as a result, they were not able to cross the borders. So they became reproductively isolated, and as a result, after multiple rounds of reproduction, they now evolved into 4 distinct species that do not interbreed with one another. So this will be an example of allopatric speciation because there's a geographic barrier. Okay, scenario number 2. Orcas, killer whales, inhabit all the world's oceans and can travel more than 100 kilometers a day. There are no known geographical barriers for orcas. However, in the Northeast Pacific, the resident, the transient, and the offshore orcas avoid each other and do not interbreed despite living in the same water. The resident orcas specialize in foraging for fish, especially salmon. The transient orcas target marine mammals and seabirds. The offshore orcas specialize in Pacific halibut and Pacific sleeper sharks. So they have very different food sources. They are utilizing different set of resources in the same geographic location. So these 3 populations of orcas are different in shape, size, and coloration. They also have different vocal behaviors and social structures, which are really important for their survival and how they function. So this is an example of a sympatric speciation because, again, they're living in the same area. They're living in the same body of water. However, each group of orcas, they are utilizing very different resources. As a result, they become reproductively isolated, largely because their diet and way of hunting determine their social structures and social behaviors. As a result, they start breeding just among themselves and they eventually evolve into 3 distinct species. All right, and that last one, scenario number 3. In a region contaminated with mine tailings, individuals of buffalo grass species that are tolerant to heavy metals survive well on contaminated soil, like the ones shown on here. Other individuals of the same buffalo grass species, they do poorly on contaminated soil. As a result, they only grow on uncontaminated soil. So even though a little bit of interbreeding still occurs in the beginning, eventually these subgroups of buffalo grass, they're only interbreeding and hybridizing with one another, and they become reproductively isolated enough to a point where they accumulate enough genetic differences to have slightly different flowering time. So this is that rare example of parapatric speciation, where there's a hybrid zone that displays very distinct types of soils or very distinct types of climate in that hybrid zone. So this is parapatric speciation. Okay, so now the last idea that we're going to talk about is the rate of speciation, how fast speciation occurs. There are 2 accepted models that explains rate of speciation. The first one is gradualism. Gradualism, as the name implies, says that evolution happens continuously over long periods of time, and it happens very, very slowly, gradually, as all these organisms accumulate slight gradual changes, one generation after the other. Okay, so that is gradualism. Now, punctuated equilibrium is shown on the left right here. So this model suggests that So here's the original species, right? Original ancestral species. So that original species actually experiences a period of stasis where little to no changes happen. Then something extreme happens in the environment, and that species rapidly evolves into, rapidly changes into a new form or shape, okay, depending on whatever happened in the environment, okay. Then that changed species also experiences another round of stasis where there's very minimal changes occurring, and then something drastic happens in the environment again, and they rapidly change and evolve into separate species, and this happens over and over and over again. And the idea behind punctuated equilibrium, the evidence behind punctuated equilibrium, is actually from the incomplete records of fossil evidence. So when scientists are digging up fossils and studying the fossils, they were not able to find all these intermediate species. Rather, the fossil evidence that they found seemed to kind of rapidly jump from one form to the other. So that's the evidence behind punctuated equilibrium. And both of these models are widely accepted, and they're both considered to be valid. So it just may depend on individual cases, individual species, which, as to which of the two models is more accurate. So that concludes your notes on speciation. Your homework over the weekend is to study for Unit 5 and 6 exam. So Monday will be your Unit 5 and 6 exam. I already posted the notes that we took during tutorial on Canvas, so you can utilize that. You have your study guide, you have your practice test, so make sure you utilize all those resources in addition to all the PowerPoints, lecture presentations, videos, review games that are posted on Canvas as well. Okay, so I'll see you guys on Monday, and I hope that this video was helpful.